Hi, I want to talk to you about huge idea, a literacy skill that you're both going to analyze, understand, and also be able to talk about by the end of this, hopefully, or at least begin to talk about it, which is called author's voice. So, in the context of 7E, so if you're listening to this outside of the context, this doesn't exactly, align with what you're doing, but within our 7E work for this trimester, what you're going to be reading this week over the course of this next section, and also how you're going to apply this is you're going to, after watching this entire learning video from me, you're going to read the next quarter of your companion book. You'll see in step 3 of the learning slides that there is a Google Doc that will hold some guiding questions for you that will be exactly what you respond to and what you annotate about as you read this next section of the companion book and The Outsiders. As I say on this slide here, once this learning is done, you're going to apply this understanding of author's voice to both, your unique analysis, meaning the way you see it in both The Outsiders and your specific individual companion text. So, what is author's voice? The author's voice in anything you're reading, whether it is a piece of fantasy, fiction, or it is a podcast that is literally informational about something happening in the world. The author's voice, whether it's spoken out loud or on the page, is the author leaving behind their own personality and personal touches on the text. That could include many things, but the four things that we're really going to touch on are how the author, uniquely to themselves as an author, kind of their signature way of designing dialogue and conversations, their signature way of describing characters in the book. Are they more of a direct or indirect trait kind of author? The signature way that an author literally writes down and shows you characters' inner thoughts or kind of the absence of, and the signature way that they decide um, to just use the vocabulary. We'll talk about all of those things. So I want to start with a quote by this guy named Donald Graves, who is a person who critiques writing all the time. He's a fabulous teacher and a mentor, and he writes about author's voice that it is the imprint of ourselves on our writing. One thing that I think about is, like when you go to a museum and you think about, I mean, if you go to art museums, which I've been to more in my, I think like my young adult years and my adult years, when we look at painting, when we listen to songs, right? When we look at like just anything that is a manifestation of art, when you listen to a song on the radio, there are so many ways to tell that it's that person's song, right? Obviously, you can hear their voice, but it's also maybe, do their tunes usually have melodies that always have a little hook in them that sound the same? Or perhaps their songs are always slow, or their songs are always, include something that is just undeniably about them. When you think about writing, it's the exact same way. Every author leaves a part of their personality or their beliefs or their experiences behind in their writing. And what's really important to note is that an author's voice is sometimes that, like, the author really means to leave it behind, like a signature thing to notice that it's their work. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes it just exists that way. So, why do we learn about it and care? Like, other than it being just this like really scholarly cool thing to talk about as an English student or an English, in an English classroom. Why should we care? Well, the reason why we should care is because, going back to the reader response lens, which I taught you about before, when you, just like with music, just like with performance art and visual art and anything, news networks, when you gravitate towards specific authors' voices, it says something about you as the reader too. And that's something you'll notice over the course of your lifetime as a reader. What do you prefer? This all goes back to learning about life and learning about you too, right? If you prefer a book with this type of voice, that A, enlightens you and lets you know what you prefer and what will not waste your time, what you love, right? It also informationally, like with nonfiction, it will help you get to the point, get to the information quicker. So, going back to this slide, talking about the four things that we're going to kind of like use to investigate what an author's voice is, AKA what you're going to be looking for in your two books and annotating about. When it comes to the words they use, authors can be kind of on a spectrum, right? They can use sentences that are very formal, grammatically correct, whatever the language is that obviously the book is written in, and the grammar rules that exist within that language. But, I would say that the majority of the novels that I read that are young adults, only maybe half I feel like the author really cares about it sounding like grammatically correct English. And then on the other end of the spectrum, what's interesting is that when we think about like relaxed or slang words or even cuss words or common conversation, it doesn't mean it's not correct. It just means that it's different. And I think that as an English teacher, it's so important for me to teach that. That just because you're having a language, like think about like you know, in books, I think of Jason Reynolds' texts, for instance. I think about Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give, or books where it doesn't mean that just because you write a book to sound like a kid really speaking, that it's incorrect. That's not what that means. It just means, is it more formal? Think about like tuxedo formal, or relaxed, more of a cozy conversational word use. So that's one thing to examine. Let's look at John Green. John Green wrote The Fault in Our Stars. He wrote An Abundance of Catherines, Looking for Alaska, right? He writes in the book The Fault in Our Stars, on Saturday, my parents and I went down to the farmer's market in Broad Ripple. It was sunny, a rarity for Indiana in April, and everyone at the farmer's market was wearing short sleeves, even though the temperature didn't quite justify it. We Hoosiers are excessively optimistic about summer. On page 81, it's in that book. There's nothing necessarily like uninteresting about that passage. It's not that formal language. It's just that when you look at this, it is descriptive in a way, and punctuation wise, it is written in a way that it doesn't sound, there are no really relaxed way. There's not really like a relaxed conversational tone. It's more formal. But then on the other side, think about S.C. Hinton in The Outsiders. She writes, oh, yeah, we found out why they were with the car. They'd come with their boyfriends, but walked on them when they found out the boys had brought some booze along. The boys had gotten angry and left. You can hear in the tone, like perhaps a little bit more laid back. There are some sentences in here that are actually like if you would make this more formal, there would perhaps be commas or semicolons instead of just like these short stagnant sentences. You could also analyze author's voice by looking at the dialogue or inner thoughts with characters. And this honestly goes back to the same two qualities. Do they make the dialogue? Do they make the characters? Does the author make the characters sound like exactly like you think they would sound, like a kid that age or a person that age would sound with the actual way? We talk about code switching. I'm sure you've heard of that. But like when you talk to your teachers or your parents or your friends or the principal or the police or a person at the grocery store, whomever in your life, and it's different for everyone. But when you talk to different people in society, you're going to use different codes, right? You're going to use different vernaculars of vocabularies, the way you speak to them. Does the author create dialogue and make a person sound like they would if they were really in that situation, or is it more formal? For instance, S.E. Hinton, going back to The Outsiders. My hair was even lighter than Soda Pop's. I'd never comb it to the side like that. It just didn't look like me. It made me look younger and scareder too. Boy, howdy, I thought. This really makes me look tough. I looked like a blasted pansy. I was miserable. Think about that as opposed to Jacqueline Woodson in Harbor Me. Outside, the sun is slowly sinking. I hear my uncle drag a suitcase across the floor above me as I listen to Esteban read his father's poem. His voice on the recorder is careful and clear. I wonder if he and his dad are walking along a beach together. Look at how the inner dialogue of Ponyboy here sounds like he's actually talking to you, but Jacqueline Woodson's, this is probably Haley talking here, I think, on page 103. Um, she's talking like she's talking to a reader, not like she's really talking to herself. And that's the difference. Does the writer write inner dialogue like they're talking in a book, or are they writing it like the kid would actually say it? Remember, there's no right or wrong. It's just something to notice. When it comes to the way the author describes characters, are they extremely detailed with like a lot of direct character traits? Like think about The Outsiders, how that book opens with just like extreme direct. It almost, in my opinion, kind of makes it a little dry in the beginning because you're just getting through all of this imagery so that you can imagine the people. Does the author tend to do that? I think of Jane Austen, if you've ever read Jane Austen, or like, uh, writers that really care that like the very first few chapters are just like all about setting the scene and giving you direct character traits so the images are so clear in your mind. Or the character descriptions described like more indirectly. Maybe they're sprinkled throughout the book, but it's just not that way. Just the beginning of the book, not that way. It's so much more sprinkled in throughout the text. Going back to The Outsiders, right? Just because that's what we're reading right now. Think about the beginning of the book when Dally, for instance, is described so vividly, like page 3, right? But then in The Hunger Games, 27, 77. The point I'm making here is as we get further into the book, if you've ever read Hunger Games, right? Um, we can infer stuff about the characters, but it's a little bit further into the text. One of the last things I want to talk to you about is the author's voice authentic. If you don't know what the word authentic means, I think you do instinctually know what it means, but to be authentic, there's obviously like formal definitions of the word, but it just means like, does it seem real to you? Does it seem real? And real means that it fits. I wrote here, when we think of the author's voice and what they are creating, we have to analyze whether it fits the story and the characters. We have to think if it fits the age and the actions and the thoughts of the character. And you get to decide as a reader, does this voice sound, and this obviously goes back to the youthful and stuff too. Does it sound authentic? Does it sound real? Does it sound far-fetched? A lot of times people will criticize authors who are of a different gender than the person they're writing for, or a different age, or even a different race or culture, right? Because it's really, 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 you can be really skeptical. Like, do you feel like this person is authentically doing a good job? Especially in the era they're writing it, right? There's also something to think about called author's authority. The word authority just means that you have this like level of like okayness and like you have the okay, the permission to write about the thing you're writing about. And the person who gives you permission, I mean, you can do whatever you want in your life. You can write about whatever. But the person who's receiving the story you're writing, are they going to dismiss it and almost find it offensive because you wrote something that you didn't really have the right to, speak about? Author's authority can be described as this level of authority that an author has gained for a certain topic. So if the author publishes on a trustworthy website, or the author is someone that has honestly just worked to acquire the knowledge to write about what they're writing about, that gives them more clout or more authority. If you don't know what clout means, you should look up that word. Their credibility and the authority grows. And in turn, this also helps increase the authority of other platforms they are featured on, right? So, do they have the relevant experiences and authority to be talking about the specific topic or even the age group? You can be super smart and still not have the authority to talk about a 12-year-old's experience, right? I think about specifically the In Other Words for Home, the book that we read a little bit ago by Jasmine Warga. We talked about how she writes this book about a refugee who has moved, seeking refuge with her mother and future, sister. They immigrate to the US. But Jasmine Warga, the author herself, had to do research, had to do intense, like first person interviewing research with her cousin and other relatives who have experienced that to have the authority. Because as an author, you sure as heck know that you're not going to be taken seriously by an intellectual audience if you don't have the authority to talk about something. Also S.E. Hinton, right? Like in The Outsiders, she talks about social classes, gangs, how people are treated differently based on who they are. And at the very beginning, like, why does she have authority to talk about this topic? Because she states, even in the introduction of this book, and like we talked about at the beginning, she has the authority to talk about it because she was there. Now, what's interesting is she of the social classes she speaks about? We don't know. Have you done that research? So when you are done with this learning, I want you to go back at any point in time. I also want you to reach out to me if anything is not explicit and not, doesn't click still. That is your first job. It's so important for you to maybe, process this information. And then you're going to essentially analyze the author's voice using guiding questions. So you don't just have to like talk about it from nothing. In step 3, there's a Google Doc, and you're going to have these guiding questions that you're going to answer. It's important to me that you read a bunch more of your book, your companion book, and The Outsiders. You're going to apply this to chapters 7, 8, 9, probably of The Outsiders, or wherever you're at, and you're going to apply this to the next fourth of your companion book. But you can use text evidence from anywhere in your books to talk about it, to get to the point of discussing author's voice. And remember, author's voice can also be taken from things you hear about it, things you read about the book, even cover art, right? So it doesn't just have to be the actual story itself. When you are done with this video, you're going to open up that Google Doc in Learning. You obviously have slides, these slides accessible to you as well, but you're going to open up the document and then leave that document up to answer those guiding questions as you read your texts. And then you will eventually share that document with me so that I can understand how you feel about the author's voice in your book. Good job.